Legionaries. In this fifth book of my commentaries on the Gallic Wars, I recount the final conquest of Britain, where my legions brought the island's proud tribes and Cassivellaunus to submission, marking yet another victory for the Roman legions. However, even as we celebrated this triumph, the treachery of Ambiorix cast a shadow upon our success. He, with his deceit and rebellion, stirred the Gauls to rise against us. In these pages, you will witness the might of Rome as we crush this revolt and restore order to the lands we have rightfully claimed. In the consulship of Lucius Domitius and Appius Claudius, Caesar, departing from his winter quarters and heading to Italy as he was accustomed to do every year, ordered the legates in charge of the legions to ensure as many ships as possible were built during the winter and to see that the old ones were repaired. He specified the size and design of these ships. He made them a bit lower than those typically used in our seas for the sake of faster loading and beaching, especially since he had observed that the tides in that region were frequent and thus the waves were smaller. He made them a bit broader than those used in other seas to accommodate cargo and a greater number of animals. He ordered that all these ships be built for rowing, which the low sides greatly facilitated. He instructed that the materials needed to outfit the ships be brought from Spain. After completing meetings in Cisalpine Gaul, he went to Illyricum, as he had heard that the neighboring part of the province was being ravaged by raids from the Parusta. When he arrived, he demanded soldiers from the communities and ordered them to gather at a designated place. When this was reported to the Parustae, they sent ambassadors to explain that the actions were not sanctioned by their public council, and to express their willingness to make amends in any way. Caesar, accepting their explanation, demanded hostages and set a date for their delivery, warning that if they failed to comply, he would wage war against their state. When the hostages were delivered on the appointed day, Caesar appointed arbitrators to assess the damages and determine the penalty. With these matters settled and the meetings concluded, Caesar returned to Cisalpine Gaul and then proceeded to the army. Upon his arrival, after touring all the winter quarters, he found that around 600 ships of the type previously described and 28 warships were equipped and nearly ready to launch within a few days, thanks to the extraordinary dedication of the soldiers despite the extreme scarcity of supplies. He praised the soldiers and those in charge of the work, outlined what he wanted done, and ordered everyone to assemble at the port of Aetius, from which he had learned was the most convenient crossing to Britain, about 30 miles across the channel. He left behind enough troops to carry out this task. He then set out with 4 light-armed legions and 800 cavalry into the territory of the Treveri, who neither attended his counsels nor obeyed orders, and were reportedly summoning the Transrhenane Germans. This tribe is by far the most powerful in all of Gaul in terms of cavalry and has substantial infantry forces, and, as previously mentioned, it borders the Rhine. In this tribe, there was a power struggle between Indutiomarus and Cingatorix. When news of Caesar's approach and the arrival of his legions reached them, Cingatorix immediately came to Caesar, promising that he and all his followers would remain loyal and not abandon the friendship of the Roman people, and he reported on the activities in the Treveri. Indutiomarus, on the other hand, began to gather cavalry and infantry, hiding those unable to bear arms in the Arduina forest, which stretches across the middle of the Treveri territory from the Rhine to the borders of the Remi, and prepared for war. However, when some of the leaders of the tribe, influenced by their relationship with Cingatorix and fearing the approach of our army, came to Caesar to seek protection for their private interests, since they could not safeguard the state, Indutiomarus, fearing that everyone would desert him, sent envoys to Caesar. He explained that his withdrawal and refusal to come to Caesar earlier were to better control his tribe and keep them from lapsing into error due to the withdrawal of all the nobility. He stated that the tribe was under his control and that he would come to Caesar's camp if permitted and place himself and the tribe's fortunes under Caesar's protection. Caesar, understanding the real reason behind these declarations and the attempt to divert him from his planned course, yet not wanting to spend the summer with the Treveri after all the preparations for the British campaign, ordered Indutiomarus to come to him with 200 hostages. When these were delivered, including his son and all his close relatives, whom Caesar had specifically summoned. Caesar consoled Indutiomarus and encouraged him to remain loyal. Nevertheless, Caesar also convened the leading men of the Treveri individually and allied them with Cingetorix, as he believed that, given Cingetorix's demonstrated loyalty, it was important for his influence to be strong among his people. Indutiomarus, seeing his influence wane and feeling increasingly hostile towards the Romans, was deeply angered by this turn of events. With these arrangements completed, Caesar arrived at the port of Aetius with the legions. There, he learned that 60 ships built among the Meldi had been driven back by storms and had returned to the port from which they had set out, while the remaining ships were ready for sailing and fully equipped. All the cavalry of Gaul, numbering around 4,000, and the leaders from all the tribes gathered there. From these, Caesar decided to leave a few in Gaul, whose loyalty he had tested, and take the others with him as hostages, fearing that a rebellion might break out in Gaul during his absence. Among them was Dumnorix the Aeduan, about whom Caesar had previously spoken. Caesar had decided to take him with him, knowing him to be ambitious, desirous of power, influential among the Gauls, and of great authority. Additionally, Dumnorix had declared in a council of the Aedui that Caesar intended to make him king of his tribe, a statement that the Aedui found troubling and which they did not dare to send envoys to Caesar to refute or plead against. Caesar had learned of this from his own allies. At first, Dumnorix tried by all means to be left behind in Gaul, claiming that he was not used to sailing and feared the sea, and that religious obligations detained him. When he saw that his request was firmly denied, he began to incite the Gallic leaders, urging them to stay on the continent and using fear tactics, suggesting that Caesar intended to strip Gaul of all its nobility. He claimed that Caesar's plan was to take them to Britain and kill them there, away from the eyes of the Gallic people. He invoked loyalty from the others and demanded an oath that they would act in the best interest of Gaul based on their common understanding. Several reported these conversations to Caesar. Upon learning this, Caesar, valuing the dignity of the Aeduan tribe, decided to restrain and control Dumnorix by any means necessary, fearing his further audacity. Spending about 25 days in that place because unfavorable winds hindered navigation, he made efforts to keep Dumnorix under control while being fully informed of all his plans. When the weather became favorable, he ordered the soldiers and cavalry to embark on the ships, but Dumnorix, with the Aeduan cavalry, began to leave the camp without Caesar's knowledge. When Caesar was informed, he halted the departure, sent a large part of his cavalry to pursue Dumnorix, and ordered them to bring him back or kill him if he resisted. He believed that Dumnorix, who had defied orders in his presence, would not obey in his absence. When Dumnorix was caught and resisted, defending himself and calling on his men to assist him, declaring that he was free and belonged to a free state, the soldiers surrounded and killed him. The Aeduan cavalry returned to Caesar. With these matters settled, Caesar left Labienus on the continent with 3 legions and 2,000 cavalry to guard the port, procure provisions, and manage any events in Gaul, making decisions based on the circumstances. He himself set sail at sunset with 5 legions and the same number of cavalry he had left on the continent. Pushed by a gentle southwest wind, he lost his course around midnight when the wind died, and was carried farther off by the tide. At dawn, he saw Britain on his left. Following the tide's change, he rowed hard to reach the part of the island he had learned the previous summer was the best for landing. The soldiers' courage was commendable, as they matched the speed of the warships despite being in heavy transport vessels. They reached Britain around noon, and no enemy was seen in that area. Later, Caesar learned from captives that large enemy forces had gathered there, but terrified by the sight of over 800 ships, counting both the fleet built the previous year and private vessels, they had retreated inland. The Britons are now terrified by the power of Caesar. What is next? Subscribe to the channel to get the next video on Caesar's conquer of Britain. Eagle is re-landed to make sure things will go better this time. Let us see how Caesar is doing this time. Subscribe before starting. After landing his troops and securing a suitable camp location, Caesar learned from captives where the enemy forces had encamped. Leaving 10 cohorts and 300 cavalry to guard the ships, he set out before dawn to attack the enemy. He was less concerned for the ships, which were anchored on a gentle, open shore, and left Quintus Atrius in charge of them. After marching 12 miles at night, he saw the enemy forces. The enemy cavalry and charioteers moved to the riverbank to stop the Romans from crossing and began to engage in battle. Driven back by the Roman cavalry, the enemy retreated into the woods to a well-fortified position prepared for their civil wars, with the entrances blocked by felled trees. The Romans, forming a testudo formation and building an earthwork up to the fortifications, seized the position with few casualties. Caesar forbade pursuit, both because he did not know the terrain and because much of the day had been spent and he wanted time to fortify his camp. The next morning, he sent the soldiers and cavalry in 3 divisions to pursue the retreating enemy. After a significant advance and the enemy in sight, Quintus Atrius reported that a severe storm during the previous night had damaged nearly all the ships and cast them ashore, breaking anchors and rows. Seeing this great inconvenience, Caesar halted the advance, recalled the legions and cavalry, and returned to the ships. Seeing the damage firsthand, about 40 ships were lost, but the rest could be repaired with effort. Caesar selected craftsmen from the legions and sent for others from the continent, ordering Labienus to build as many ships as possible with the legions under his command. Despite the labor and effort involved, Caesar decided the best course was to haul the ships ashore and fortify them within the camp's defenses, spending about 10 days on this task without even pausing for rest at night. Leading the same forces to guard the ships, he set out again to where he had previously been. When he arrived, he found that larger British forces had gathered in that area, with supreme command given to Cassivellaunus. This leader's territory, divided from the maritime regions by the river Thames about 80 miles from the sea, had previously been in continuous conflict with other tribes. However, disturbed by the Romans' arrival, the Britons had united under Cassivellaunus for war and command. The interior of Britain is inhabited by those who are said to have been born on the island. The coastal areas are occupied by those who crossed over from Belgium for plunder and war. They kept the names of their original tribes and settled there permanently, beginning to cultivate the fields. The population is immense, and the buildings are very similar to those in Gaul. They have a large number of livestock. They use either bronze or gold coins or iron bars weighed as currency. Tin is produced inland and iron on the coast, but in small quantities. They use imported bronze. Timber of all kinds, as in Gaul, except beech and fir, is abundant. They consider it unlawful to taste hare, chicken, or goose, but they keep them for amusement. The climate is milder than in Gaul, with fewer cold spells. The island is triangular in shape, with one side facing Gaul. One angle of this side, which lies towards Kent, where nearly all ships from Gaul arrive, faces east, while the lower part faces south. This side extends about 500 miles. Another side faces Spain and the west, where Ireland is located, estimated to be about half the size of Britain, but with the same distance from Britain to Gaul. In the middle of this passage lies the island Mona, and many smaller islands are thought to exist, with some accounts claiming continuous night for 30 days around the winter solstice. We found, through inquiries, that the nights were shorter than on the continent, based on specific water measurements. The length of this side is estimated to be 700 miles. The third side faces north, with no land opposite, but facing mainly towards Germany. This side is estimated to be 800 miles long, making the total circumference of the island 2,000 miles. Of all the Britons, the inhabitants of Kent, a maritime region, are the most civilized and closely resemble Gallic customs. Most of the inland inhabitants do not grow grain, but live on milk and meat, wearing animal skins. All Britons dye their bodies with wood, producing a bluish color, giving them a more fearsome appearance in battle. They have long hair and shave all parts of their body except their head and upper lip. 10 to 12 men share wives among brothers or fathers with sons, but the children are considered to belong to the man each woman first married. The British cavalry and charioteers fiercely engaged our cavalry during the march, driving them into the woods and hills. After killing many and pursuing too eagerly, we lost some of our men. The enemy then paused and, catching our soldiers off guard and busy fortifying the camp, suddenly attacked fiercely. When Caesar sent 2 cohorts from the 2 nearest legions to assist, the Britons, terrified by the new form of battle, broke through and escaped unharmed. On that day, Quintus Liberius Durus, a military tribune, was killed. The Britons were driven back by more cohorts. In this type of battle, as the fighting occurred under everyone's eyes and near the camp, it became clear that our soldiers, due to the weight of their arms, were less suited to this kind of enemy, being unable to pursue retreating foes or leave their standards. The cavalry also fought at great risk, as the Britons often retreated deliberately, and after drawing our troops a short distance from the legions, dismounted from their chariots and engaged on foot. This made the fighting equally perilous for both retreating and pursuing cavalry. Moreover, the Britons never fought in close ranks, but scattered in widely spaced intervals, with stations positioned to provide mutual support and allow fresh troops to relieve the weary. The next day, the enemy formed a line on the hills, showing themselves in small groups and lightly challenging our cavalry. But at midday, when Caesar sent 3 legions and all the cavalry under Gaius Trebonius to forage, the Britons suddenly attacked from all sides, forcing our foragers to stay close to their standards and legions. Our men fiercely repelled the attackers and pursued them until, trusting in the legion's support, they drove the fleeing Britons headlong, killing many and allowing no chance for them to regroup, stand, or dismount from their chariots. From this route, the auxiliaries quickly dispersed and never again engaged us with their full forces. When Caesar learned of their plan, he led his army to the Thames River into the territory of Cassivellaunus. The river can only be crossed on foot at one place, and even then with difficulty. When he arrived, he saw large enemy forces drawn up on the other bank. The river bank was fortified with sharp stakes fixed in place, and similar stakes were set under the water, hidden by the river. After learning this from captives and deserters, Caesar sent the cavalry ahead and ordered the legions to follow quickly. The soldiers moved with such speed and force, even with their heads barely above the water, that the enemy could not withstand the charge of the legions and cavalry and fled from the riverbank. Cassivellaunus, as previously mentioned, having abandoned all hope of contesting the battle, dismissed most of his forces, keeping only about 4,000 charioteers. He shadowed our movements, slightly deviating from the main path, hiding in difficult and wooded areas. He drove cattle and people from the fields into the forests to hinder our progress. Whenever our cavalry ventured more freely into the fields for plundering and foraging, he would send charioteers out of the woods along all roads and paths, engaging our cavalry with great danger and preventing them from roaming freely. Caesar thus limited the distance his men could move from the legions, causing as much damage by burning and destroying as the legionaries could manage through labor and travel. Meanwhile, the Trinobantes, one of the most powerful tribes in the region, sent envoys to Caesar. Mandubracius, a young man who had sought Caesar's protection in mainland Gaul after his father was killed by Cassivellaunus and he himself had escaped death, led this group. They promised to submit to Caesar and follow his orders, asking him to protect Mandubracius from Cassivellaunus' aggression and to send him back to rule and lead the tribe. Caesar ordered them to send 40 hostages and supply grain for his army, which they quickly did. The Britons are now convinced that Caesar will make it. What is next? Will Cassivellaunus be able to resist? Or will he capitulate? Subscribe to the channel to get the next video on Caesar's conquering of Britain. Caesar is going to submit all the local tribes. It seems Cassivellaunus is still doing resistance. Let us see what Caesar's strategy is going to be this time. Don't forget to subscribe before starting. Now, after securing the Trinobantes and preventing any harm to them from his soldiers, the Cenomagni, Saguntiati, Ancalites, Bibrosi, and Cassi also sent envoys and submitted to Caesar. From them, Caesar learned that Cassivellaunus had a fortified town nearby, protected by forests and marshes, where a large number of people and cattle had gathered. The Britons referred to this as a town when they fortified a forest with a rampart and ditch to avoid enemy raids. Caesar set out with his legions and found the place well defended by nature and fortifications. He attacked from two sides, but the enemy, after a brief resistance, could not withstand the Romans' assault and fled to the other side of the town. A large number of cattle and many fugitives were captured or killed. While these events were occurring, Cassivellaunus sent messengers to Kent, as previously mentioned, a coastal region governed by 4 kings: Cincinnatus, Carvilius, Taximagulus, and Segovax. He ordered them to gather all their forces and suddenly attack and assault the naval camp. When they reached the camp, our forces made a sortie, killed many of the enemy, captured their leader Lugatorix, and returned safely to the camp. Hearing of this battle and realizing the losses he had suffered, the devastation of his lands, and the defection of many tribes, Cassivellaunus, deeply troubled, sent envoys through the Adrabate Commius to negotiate surrender with Caesar. Caesar, planning to winter on the continent due to sudden unrest in Gaul, and knowing that little summer remained, realized that it would be easy to extend his campaign. He demanded hostages, decided on the annual tribute that Britain would pay to Rome, and forbade Cassivellaunus from harming Mandubratius and the Trinovantes. After receiving the hostages, Caesar led his army back to the coast and found his ships repaired. Given the large number of captives and the loss of some ships to storms, he decided to transport his army back in 2 trips. It so happened that, despite the great number of ships and numerous voyages, not a single ship carrying soldiers was lost in either this or the previous year. However, of those that returned empty from the continent after unloading the soldiers or those that Labienus had built, few reached their destination, while most were driven back. After waiting in vain for some time, and not wanting to be excluded from sailing due to the season's timing, as the equinox was approaching, Caesar packed his soldiers into a smaller number of ships. Setting sail at the start of the 2nd watch, he reached the mainland at dawn, bringing all the ships safely to port. After beaching his ships and conducting a meeting of the Gauls at Samarabreva, Caesar, due to a poor grain harvest caused by droughts in Gaul, was forced to quarter his army differently than in previous years and distribute the legions across several tribes. He sent 1 legion to the Morini under Gaius Fabius, another to the Nervi under Quintus Cicero, a 3rd to the Isubi under Lucius Ratius, and a 4th to the Remi near the borders of the Treveri with Titus Labienus. He stationed 3 legions among the Belgae, with Marcus Crassus as quaestor and Lucius Munatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius as legates. He sent 1 legion, recently recruited from across the Po River, and 5 cohorts into the territory of the Eburones, which lies between the Meuse and the Rhine, under the rule of Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. He ordered Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta to command these troops. By distributing the legions in this way, he believed he could easily address the grain shortage. Despite this, all the legions' winter quarters, except for the one under Lucius Ratius in the most peaceful and quiet region, were within 100 miles. Meanwhile, Caesar decided to stay in Gaul until he knew the legions were settled and the winter quarters fortified. In the territory of the Carnutes, there was a man of high rank named Deceives, whose ancestors had ruled the tribe. Caesar restored him to his ancestral position due to his exceptional valor and loyalty, which he had demonstrated in all the wars. Now in his 3rd year of rule, Deceives was killed by his enemies, encouraged openly by many in the tribe. This news was brought to Caesar. Fearing that the incident might incite a wider rebellion, Caesar ordered Lucius Plancus to quickly march to the Carnutes with his legion from Belgica, winter there, and send to him those responsible for Deceives' murder. Meanwhile, he received reports from all his legates and quaestors that they had reached their winter quarters and fortified their positions. About 15 days after the legions had settled in winter quarters, a sudden uprising and revolt broke out, led by Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. Having met Sabinus and Cotta at the borders of their territory and delivered grain to the winter quarters, they were incited by Indutiomarus of the Treveri and assembled their men, suddenly attacking the camp with a large force. Our troops quickly armed themselves, manned the ramparts, and, with the Spanish cavalry sallying out from one side, won a cavalry battle. Seeing their attack fail, the enemy withdrew their forces. Following their custom, they called out for someone from our side to come forward for a conference, claiming they had things to discuss regarding the general situation, hoping to resolve the conflict. Gaius Arpinius, a Roman knight and close associate of Quintus Treacherous and Quintus Junius, who had previously been sent by Caesar to Ambiorix and had become familiar with him, were sent to negotiate. Ambiorix spoke to them, expressing his gratitude to Caesar for freeing him from tribute to the Aduatuci, his neighboring tribe, and for returning his son and nephew, who had been held in chains by the Aduatuci. He claimed he had not acted out of personal will or judgment, but under compulsion from his tribe, which had as much authority over him as he did over them. He explained that the cause of the war was the sudden conspiracy of the Gauls, which he could not resist. He asserted that he was not so ignorant as to believe he could defeat the Roman people with his forces alone. Instead, it was a collective decision of Gaul to attack all of Caesar's winter quarters simultaneously, ensuring no legion could aid another. Given his loyalty to Caesar, he now advised and pleaded with Treacherous to consider his and his soldiers' safety. He warned that a large force of Germans had crossed the Rhine and would arrive in 2 days. They should decide whether to lead their troops out of winter quarters before their neighbors became aware, either to Cicero or Labienus, both of whom were within about 50 miles. He pledged and confirmed under oath that he would provide a safe passage through his territory. In doing so, he would also benefit his tribe by freeing them from the burden of the winter quarters and show his gratitude to Caesar. After delivering this speech, Ambiorix departed. Arpinius and Junius reported what they had heard to the legates. Disturbed by the suddenness of the situation, they thought it unwise to ignore the message, even though it came from the enemy. They were especially concerned because it seemed hardly credible that an insignificant and lowly tribe like the Eburones would dare to make war on the Roman people on their own initiative. They brought the matter to a council, where a great controversy arose among them. Lucius Aurunculeius and several military tribunes and centurions of the first rank believed nothing should be done hastily, and that they should not leave their winter quarters without Caesar's orders. They argued that they could withstand any large enemy forces, including the Germans, in their fortified winter quarters. They cited the example of having repelled the enemy's first attack with many inflicted wounds. They were not in need of supplies, and aid would arrive from the nearest winter quarters and from Caesar. Finally, they argued that it would be most foolish and disgraceful to take counsel on critical matters based on the enemy's suggestion. After having submitted the Britons, new challenges are coming from the Gauls. It seems the Gallic Wars will continue for a while. You have no choice but subscribe to the channel and go for the next video. See you soon. Caesar's tribunes and legati Treacherous, Cotta, and Sabinus are alone with their courts and urged by the enemy. It seems the Germans crossed the Rhine. Will they be able to face the new challenges? The only way to know is to watch this video. Do not forget to subscribe and go ahead. In opposition to these views, Treacherous repeatedly exclaimed that they would be acting too late if larger enemy forces, including the Germans, had already assembled, or if a disaster had occurred in the nearby winter quarters. He said the opportunity for consulting was brief. He believed Caesar had likely already departed for Italy. Neither the Carnutes would have planned to kill Tescidius, nor the Eburones would have dared to approach the camp with such contempt for the Romans if Caesar had been present. He insisted that the current situation, not the enemy's words, should be considered. The Rhine was nearby. The Germans resented the death of Ariovistus and the recent Roman victories, and Gaul was inflamed by numerous insults under Roman rule, with their former military glory extinguished. Lastly, he questioned who would believe that Ambiorix would have descended to such a plan without a definite cause. His opinion was safe in either case. If there was no serious threat, they could reach the nearest legion without danger. If all of Gaul conspired with the Germans, their only hope for safety lay in speed. He asked what outcome Cotta and those who disagreed with him anticipated. If not immediate danger, prolonged siege and starvation were certain. After debating on both sides, and with Cotta and the senior officers strongly opposing, Sabinus finally said, "If you insist," raising his voice so that many soldiers could hear, "I am not one who fears death as much as the rest of you. They will understand. if something more serious happens, they will hold you accountable. If it were up to you, we would join the nearest winter quarters and face the common fate of war with the others in 2 days, not perish far from the rest, either by sword or famine." The council adjourned, and the officers surrounded the two legates, begging them not to jeopardize the safety of the whole force through their disagreement and obstinacy. They argued it would be easy to follow either course, staying or leaving, if everyone agreed. However, they saw no safety in division. The debate continued until midnight. Finally, Cotta, deeply moved, gave in. Sabinus's plan prevailed. It was announced they would march at first light. The rest of the night was spent in vigilance, as each soldier gathered what he could carry and decided what to leave behind from the winter quarters equipment. They found many reasons for staying being dangerous, and their fatigue and sleeplessness increased the danger. At dawn, they set out from the camp in a long column with many heavy packs, convinced they were following the advice of their friend Ambiorix, not an enemy. But the enemy, having sensed their departure from the night noises and watch movements, set up an ambush in 2 parts in the woods, in a suitable and concealed place about 2 miles from the Roman camp, waiting for the Romans to approach. When most of the Roman column had descended into a large valley, the enemy suddenly appeared from both sides of the valley, began pressing the rear and preventing the vanguard from climbing up, and started the battle in a place most disadvantageous to our troops. Only then did Treacherous, who had foreseen none of this, panic, run about, and hastily arrange the cohorts. However, he did this fearfully and ineffectively, so it seemed everything was failing him. This often happens to those who are forced to make decisions in the midst of an action. On the other hand, Cotta, who had anticipated such occurrences on the march and therefore had not supported the departure, did not fail in any aspect of his duty to the common safety. He performed the duties of both general and soldier, encouraging and rallying the troops. As they could not easily attend to everything themselves due to the length of the column and could not foresee what was needed at each place, they ordered the troops to abandon the baggage and form a circle. Although such a plan should not be criticized in such circumstances, it was executed poorly. It both diminished the soldiers' hope and made the enemy more eager to fight, as it appeared to be done out of great fear and desperation. Furthermore, what was inevitable happened. The soldiers left their posts en masse, hurried to seize and carry off their most prized possessions from the baggage, and filled the air with shouts and cries. The barbarians were not lacking in strategy. Their leaders ordered the whole army to refrain from leaving their position. They declared that all the plunder would be reserved for them, and that everything the Romans left behind would be theirs. Consequently, they believed that all their hopes lay in victory. The enemies fought with equal bravery and determination. Our men, though abandoned by their leader and fortune, placed all their hope in their courage. Whenever a cohort charged, a great number of the enemy fell from that part. Seeing this, Ambiorix ordered them to throw their spears from a distance, not to approach too closely, and wherever the Romans made a charge, to give way, relying on their light arms and daily practice to sustain no harm, and then to pursue the retreating Romans. Following these instructions meticulously, whenever any cohort left the circle and charged, the enemies fled swiftly. Meanwhile, that part of the circle was inevitably exposed, and spears were received from the open flank. When the Romans began to return to their original position, they were surrounded both by those who had retreated and those who had stood nearby. If they decided to hold their ground, no space was left for courage, and they could not avoid the many javelins hurled by such a large number of enemies. Nevertheless, though beset by so many difficulties and receiving many wounds, they held their ground, and having consumed a great part of the day in fighting, did nothing unworthy of themselves from dawn until the 8th hour. During this time, Titus Balventius, who had commanded the first rank the previous year, a man of great courage and authority, was pierced through both thighs with a javelin. Quintus Lucanius, of the same rank, while bravely fighting to help his surrounded son, was killed. Lucius Cotta, the legate, while encouraging all the cohorts and ranks, was struck full in the face by a slingshot. Alarmed by these events, Quintus Treacherous, seeing Ambiorix in the distance encouraging his men, sent his interpreter, Gnaeus Pompeius, to him to request that he spare him and his soldiers. Ambiorix responded that if he wished to speak with him, it would be allowed, and he hoped to gain something from the multitude for the soldiers' safety. He said no harm would come to him, and he would guarantee this with his own word. Treacherous consulted with the wounded Cotta, asking whether they should abandon the fight and negotiate with Ambiorix. He hoped to secure their safety and that of the soldiers through this negotiation. Cotta refused to go to an armed enemy and remained steadfast in his decision. Sabinus ordered the tribunes and centurions who were around him to follow, and when he approached Ambiorix, he was ordered to throw down his arms and obeyed the command. He instructed his men to do the same. While they were discussing terms, Ambiorix deliberately prolonged the conversation, and Sabinus was gradually surrounded and killed. Then, according to their custom, the victors raised a shout and attacked our men, disrupting their ranks. Lucius Cotta died fighting bravely with most of his soldiers. The survivors retreated to the camp they had left. Lucius Petrosidius, the standard bearer, under heavy enemy pressure, threw the standard within the fortifications, but was killed fighting bravely before the camp. They withstood the attack until nightfall, and during the night, realizing their situation was hopeless, they all killed themselves. A few survivors from the battle, through unknown paths in the woods, reached the winter quarters of Titus Labienus and reported what had happened. Exhilarated by this victory, Ambiorix immediately set out with his cavalry for the Aduatuci, who were neighbors to his kingdom, not resting day or night, and ordered the infantry to follow. After explaining the situation and inciting the Aduatuci, he reached the Nervii the next day. He urged them not to miss the opportunity to free themselves forever and to avenge the wrongs they had suffered from the Romans. He explained that 2 legates had been killed and a large part of the Roman army had been wiped out. It would be an easy task to overwhelm the legion wintering with Cicero and annihilate it. He offered his assistance for this task. With this speech, he easily persuaded the Nervii. The situation is now getting serious for Caesar's legions in Gaul. How will he react to this loss? Will Titus Labienus get the situation under control before Caesar gets back to Gaul? Subscribe not to miss the next chapter of the Gallic Wars. The Romans trapped and surrounded by the Gauls. Officers dead, and Caesar still does not know of this very bad situation. Will Cicero manage to let Caesar know? Subscribe to the channel and watch the video to know more. So, they immediately sent messengers to the Sutrones, Grudii, Levaci, Plumaxi, and Didymi, who were all under their rule, and gathered as many men as they could. They suddenly swooped down on Cicero's winter quarters before news of Treacherous' death had reached him. As expected, a number of soldiers who had gone into the woods to gather wood and construct fortifications were intercepted by the sudden arrival of the cavalry. With these men surrounded, the Eburones, Nervii, Aduatuci, and all their allies and dependents began to attack the legion. Our men quickly grabbed their arms and climbed the rampart. The day was barely held out, as the enemy placed all their hope in speed and believed that victory, once gained, would secure them as perpetual victors. Cicero immediately sent letters to Caesar, offering great rewards to those who would carry them. But all the roads were blocked, and the messengers were intercepted. At night, from the materials they had gathered for the fortifications, they quickly built about 120 towers with incredible speed. They completed whatever seemed necessary for defense. The next day, the enemy attacked the camp with even larger forces, filled the ditch, and resisted the same way as the previous day. This same situation continued for several days. No part of the night was spared for rest or work, and no opportunity was given to the sick or wounded for rest. Whatever was needed for the next day's attack was prepared at night. Many stakes were charred. A large number of wall javelins were made, towers were built, and battlements and parapets were woven from wicker. Though Cicero was very weak in health, he did not even leave himself the night for rest, and the soldiers' constant efforts and pleas forced him to spare himself. Then the leaders and chiefs of the Nervii, who had some way to speak with Cicero and had some grounds for friendship, asked for a conversation. Granted permission, they repeated the same points Ambiorix had made to Treacherous. All of Gaul was in arms. The Germans had crossed the Rhine. The winter quarters of Caesar and the other legates were being attacked. They added news of Sabinus' death and displayed Ambiorix to lend credibility. They said it was a mistake for the Romans to hope for help from those who had no confidence in their own situation. Nevertheless, they were of such a mindset towards Cicero and the Roman people that they refused nothing but the winter quarters and did not wish for this habit to continue. They offered the Romans safe passage from the winter quarters to go wherever they wished without fear. Cicero replied to this that it was not the custom of the Roman people to accept terms from an armed enemy. If they were willing to disarm, they could use him as a mediator and send envoys to Caesar, hoping to achieve their requests through his justice. Rejected from this hope, the Nervi began to surround the winter quarters with a 9-foot rampart and a 15-foot trench. They had learned these techniques from us during previous years and were taught by the captives they secretly held from our army. Despite lacking appropriate tools, they attempted to cut turf with their swords and dig the earth with their hands and cloaks. This effort revealed their massive number. They completed a fortification 15 miles in circumference in less than 3 hours and spent the following days constructing towers, siege hooks, and mantlets, as instructed by the same captives. On the 7th day of the siege, with a strong wind arising, they began to hurl burning clay balls and heated javelins onto the huts covered with straw in the Gallic fashion. The huts quickly caught fire, and the wind spread the flames throughout the camp. The enemy, with a great shout as if they had already won, began to drive forward their towers and mantlets and to climb the rampart with ladders. But the valor and presence of mind of the soldiers were such that, although they were being burned from all sides and overwhelmed by a great number of javelins, and saw all their possessions and all their fortunes in flames, not one of them abandoned his post on the rampart. They fought with the greatest intensity and bravery. This day was the most severe for our men, but it had the outcome that a large number of the enemy were wounded and killed as they had crowded under the very rampart, and the last ranks did not allow the first to retreat. The flames abated slightly, and in one spot a tower was brought up and touched the rampart. The centurions of the 3rd cohort withdrew from the spot where they were standing and called the enemy to enter if they wished, but none dared to advance. Then, showered with stones from all sides, they were driven back, and the tower was set on fire. In that legion were 2 very brave men, centurions approaching the first ranks, Titus Pullo and Lucius Vorenus. These men had ongoing disputes about who was to be preferred, and they competed fiercely every year for promotion. Of these, Pullo, when the fighting at the fortifications was most intense, said, "Why do you hesitate, Vorenus? Or what better opportunity do you seek for proving your valor? This day will judge our disputes." After saying this, he advanced outside the fortifications and charged into the part of the enemy that seemed most crowded. Not even Vorenus then stayed within the rampart, but fearing what everyone would think, followed. Pullo threw his javelin into the enemy and struck one who was running forward from the multitude. When he was hit and knocked unconscious, the enemies protected him with their shields, and all threw their spears at Pullo, giving him no chance to retreat. Pullo's shield was pierced, and a javelin stuck in his belt. This turned aside his scabbard and hindered his right hand as he tried to draw his sword, and he was surrounded by the enemy. His rival Vorenus ran to his aid and helped him in his distress. The whole multitude turned from Pullo to Vorenus, thinking Pullo was killed by the javelin. Vorenus fought at close quarters with his sword and drove back the enemy a little, killing one. While he pressed on more eagerly, he fell into a lower position. Pullo ran to help him again, and both returned to the fortifications, safe after killing several enemies with great glory. Thus fortune handled both in their rivalry, so that each became the other's helper and savior, and it could not be decided which of the two seemed superior in valor. As the siege grew graver and more intense each day, and especially as many soldiers were worn out by their wounds, reducing the number of defenders, messages, and messengers to Caesar were sent more frequently. Some of these were captured and tortured to death in front of our soldiers. Inside was a Nervian named Furtico, born of a noble family, who had fled to Cicero at the start of the siege and proved his loyalty. He persuaded his slave with promises of freedom and great rewards to deliver a letter to Caesar. This man, carrying the letter tied to a javelin, mingled with the Gauls without any suspicion and reached Caesar. From him, Caesar learned of Cicero's and the legion's danger. Upon receiving the letter around the 11th hour, Caesar immediately sent a messenger to the quaestor, Marcus Crassus, in the Bellivici, whose winter quarters were 25 miles away. He ordered him to set out with his legion at midnight and come to him quickly. Crassus left with the messenger. Caesar also sent another to Gaius Fabius, instructing him to lead his legion into the territory of the Atrebates, where he knew he had to pass. He wrote to Labienus, asking him to come with his legion to the territory of the Nervi if it could be done for the public good. He did not think it wise to wait for the rest of the army, which was farther away, and gathered about 400 cavalry from the nearest winter quarters. Now Caesar knows about Ambiorix's rebellion. I'm not so sure he will be clement with Ambiorix. To know the end, you need to subscribe to the channel and wait for the next video. Caesar is back, and there will be yet another battle to put at rest the insurrection of the Gauls. Show down before the winter begins. Subscribe and watch the video to discover more. Thanks. Learning of Crassus's arrival from his scouts around the 3rd hour, Caesar advanced 20 miles that day. He appointed Crassus to command Semirabreva with a legion, as he was leaving there all the army's baggage, hostages of the states, public documents, and all the grain he had brought there to endure the winter. Fabius, following orders, met Caesar on the march with his legion. Labienus, aware of Sabinus's death and the slaughter of the cohorts, and having received all the forces of the Treveri, feared he could not withstand the enemy's attack if he made a retreat from the winter quarters that looked like a flight, especially since he knew they were emboldened by their recent victory. He wrote back to Caesar, explaining the danger involved in leading his legion out of the winter quarters and describing the events among the Eburones. He reported that Caesar, approving of his plan, though disappointed that his forces were reduced from 3 legions to 2, placed all hope for their common safety in speed. He hurried into the territory of the Nervi. There, he learned from captives about the situation at Cicero's camp and the peril they were in. He persuaded a certain Gallic horseman with great rewards to deliver a letter to Cicero. He sent this letter written in Greek characters to prevent the enemy from understanding it if intercepted. If the messenger could not approach the camp, he was instructed to tie the letter to a javelin and throw it within the fortifications. The letter stated that Caesar was on his way with the legions and urged them to maintain their former courage. The Gallic messenger, fearing danger, threw the javelin as instructed. By chance, it stuck to a tower and went unnoticed by our men for 2 days, but was discovered on the 3rd day by a soldier who brought it to Cicero. After reading it, Cicero recited it in a meeting of the soldiers, filling everyone with the greatest joy. Then, smoke from distant fires was seen, dispelling all doubt about the arrival of the legions. Upon learning this, the Gauls abandoned the siege and hurried with all their forces towards Caesar. There were about 60,000 armed men. Given the opportunity, Cicero once again requested the Gallic messenger from Vertigo, who was mentioned earlier, to carry a letter to Caesar. He advised him to travel cautiously and carefully, writing in the letter that the enemy had left and directed all their forces towards Caesar. Receiving these letters around midnight, Caesar informed his men and bolstered their spirits for the fight. At first light, he moved his camp and, after advancing about 4 miles, spotted the enemy's multitude across a valley and a stream. It was very risky to engage in such a disadvantageous position with such small forces. So, knowing that Cicero had been freed from siege, he decided to slow his pace. He set up camp in the most advantageous position possible, despite the limited number of his men, about 7,000 with no baggage, contracting his camp to appear as small and weak as possible to the enemy. Meanwhile, he sent scouts in all directions to find the best way to cross the valley. That day, there were small cavalry skirmishes near the water, and both sides held their positions. The Gauls were waiting for reinforcements that had not yet arrived, and Caesar hoped to lure the enemy across the valley by feigning fear so they would engage in battle near his camp. If this failed, he wanted to find a safer way to cross the valley and stream. At first light, the enemy's cavalry approached the camp and engaged in a skirmish with our cavalry. Caesar ordered his cavalry to retreat deliberately and take shelter in the camp, instructing that the fortifications be heightened and the gates blocked, all with great commotion and the pretense of fear. Encouraged by these actions, the enemy brought their forces across and arranged their line in a disadvantageous position. They even approached the camp, threw weapons inside, and sent heralds around proclaiming that any Gaul or Roman who wished to switch sides before the 3rd hour could do so without risk. After that time, there would be no opportunity. They despised our men so much that they began to dismantle the rampart and fill the trenches. Then Caesar, opening all the gates and sending out the cavalry, quickly put the enemy to flight, killing a large number of them and stripping them of their weapons. Fearing to pursue them further due to the intervening woods and marshes, and not wanting to leave the position, Caesar reached Cicero the same day with all his forces safe. He marveled at the towers, mantlets, and fortifications the enemy had constructed. He found that not 1 in 10 of Cicero's men was unwounded, and from these facts, judged how great the danger and how admirable the courage had been. He praised Cicero and the legion for their service, commended each centurion and tribune by name for their exceptional bravery, as attested by Cicero. From captives, he learned more precisely of the fate of Sabinus and Cotta. The next day, he held an assembly, recounted the events, and consoled and encouraged his soldiers, explaining that the loss was due to the rashness of a legate and should be borne more calmly, because the harm had been mitigated by the immortal gods and their own valor, leaving the enemy no long-lasting joy or themselves prolonged sorrow. Meanwhile, news of Caesar's victory was carried to Labienus through the Remi with incredible speed. Though Caesar had reached Cicero's camp around the 11th hour and arrived about 60 miles away by the next day, before midnight, shouts of victory and congratulations arose from Labienus's camp. This news, reaching the Treveri, caused Indutiomarus to abandon his plan to attack Labienus's camp the next day and flee with all his forces back to the Treveri. Caesar sent Fabius with his legion back to winter quarters, and he himself decided to winter with 3 legions near Samarabriva, occupying 3 separate camps. Given the significant unrest in Gaul, he decided to stay with the army for the entire winter. For almost no time during the winter passed without some news of Gallic plans or movements, causing Caesar concern. He learned from Lucius Roscius, who commanded the 13th Legion, that large forces from the tribes known as the Ambiorix had gathered to attack him and had approached within 8 miles of his winter quarters. However, upon hearing of Caesar's victory, they dispersed in such a hurry that it appeared more like a flight. Caesar, having summoned the chiefs of each tribe to him, managed to keep most of Gaul loyal through a combination of threats, declaring that he knew what was happening, and encouragement. Nevertheless, the Senones, a tribe particularly strong and influential among the Gauls, attempted to kill Cassivellaunus, whom Caesar had installed as king over them. His brother, Maurotascus, had held the kingship upon Caesar's arrival in Gaul, as had their ancestors. When Cassivellaunus became aware of the plot, he fled. They pursued him to the borders, expelled him from his kingdom and home, and sent envoys to Caesar to explain their actions. However, when Caesar ordered the entire Senate to come to him, they disobeyed. This situation had such a profound effect on the barbarians and caused such a change in everyone's attitudes that, except for the Aedui and Remi, whom Caesar always held in high regard, one for their long-standing and constant loyalty to the Roman people, the other for their recent services in the Gallic War, nearly every tribe was viewed with suspicion. This is perhaps not surprising, given many other reasons, but especially because those who were considered the bravest warriors now had to endure the commands of the Roman people, which they found deeply humiliating. The Treveri and Indutiomarus did not waste any time during the entire winter, constantly sending envoys across the Rhine, stirring up the tribes, promising money, and declaring that a large part of the Roman army had been killed, leaving only a much smaller portion remaining. Nevertheless, no German tribe could be persuaded to cross the Rhine, as they claimed they had already tested their fortune twice, once in the War of Ariovistus and once in the crossing of the Tencteri, and they were not willing to risk it again. Losing this hope, Indutiomarus nevertheless began to gather and train forces, procure horses from nearby tribes, and attract exiles and outlaws from all over Gaul with great rewards. He gained so much authority in Gaul that delegations came to him from all directions, seeking his favor and friendship both publicly and privately. When he realized that people were coming to him willingly, and that the Senones and Carnutes were being incited by guilt on one side, and the Nervii and Aduatuci were preparing for war against the Romans on the other, he called an armed council. This is the beginning of a war by Gallic custom, where all able-bodied men gather by common law. the last to arrive, is killed in front of the gathered multitude after enduring all kinds of tortures. In this council, he declared his son-in-law, Cingatorix, an enemy and confiscated his property because he had remained loyal to Caesar. After completing these tasks, he announced in the council that he had been invited by the Senones, Carnutes, and several other Gallic tribes to march through the lands of the Remi, plunder their fields, and before doing so, attack Labienus's camp. He instructed them on what he wanted to be done. Labienus, holding a well-fortified camp, both by nature and by hand, feared nothing for his safety or that of his legion, but was considering how he might seize any opportunity for a successful action. Learning from Cingatorix and his relatives about Indutiomarus's speech in the council, he sent messengers to nearby tribes and summoned cavalry from all directions, setting a specific day for them to assemble. Meanwhile, Indutiomarus, with increasing contempt, approached the camp almost daily with all his cavalry, sometimes to observe the camp's layout, sometimes for talks or to intimidate. His cavalry often threw weapons inside the rampart. Labienus kept his men inside the fortifications and increased the appearance of fear as much as possible. As Indutiomarus approached the camp with increasing disdain, Labienus, having brought in cavalry from all the nearby tribes with great diligence, ensured none of his plans were revealed or reported to the Treveri. Meanwhile, Indutiomarus, following his daily routine, approached the camp and spent a large part of the day there. His cavalry threw weapons and taunted our men to fight. When our men gave no response, and it seemed fitting, they dispersed and left towards evening. Suddenly, Labienus sent out all his cavalry through 2 gates. He ordered and commanded them to pursue the enemy and put them to flight, and, as he expected, this happened. They all targeted Indutiomarus, forbidding anyone from wounding another before Indutiomarus was killed, as he did not want him to escape while others were being attacked. He offered great rewards to those who killed him and sent cohorts to support the cavalry. Labienus's plan was successful. Indutiomarus was caught and killed while crossing a river, and his head was brought back to the camp. The returning cavalry pursued and killed as many of the enemy as they could. Upon learning of this, all the assembled forces of the Eburones and Nervi dispersed, and Caesar found Gaul much quieter after this event. This was a kind of happy end for Caesar. The next Liber 6 is waiting to be read, listened, and seen. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more content. Thanks, and see you soon, Legionary.